Blessings upon you, my first goddaughter, Jan, and also on Marie, Karen, Shelley, and Alexis, who also call me Gaudie. To other family members and friends from all walks of life, I offer God's consolation as we come to share in a celebration of Susan's life. Uncle Sidney, Aunt Susan, and Uncle Reggie have always been a loving part of our children's lives. Of course, as Gaudie, I'm special. Losing Dad and Mom within a few months of each other serves only to emphasize the uncertainty of this life and the permanence of their and our transition to glory. Obviously, I could talk old stories about Susan for days on end, but I will summarize. In January 1950, a selected group of high school graduates gathered at the abandoned Army base, now C.C. Sweeting High School, to establish the first teachers' training college in the Bahamas. Most of those present were known to me, and as we chatted, a stranger walked up to me and announced, "My name is Susan Bethel. Who are you?" For the next 70-odd years, that Susan Bethel Wallace was my best friend. Over those years, she and I became we. We were among the first graduates of the Bahamas Teachers College. We revived the Bahamas Union of Teachers. We taught at schools on New Providence, and we traveled to the Family Islands as senior officers in the Ministry of Education. We studied at the University of Miami and resided in the same building near Miracle Mile. We studied abroad, she in England and I in the United States. We worked for the same financial institution for 13 and a half years. We lived next door to each other for over 9 years and within a few blocks of one another for another 30 years. One of the best things about being Susan's friend is that I enjoyed the fruit of the Spirit she embodied, even before she had consciously appropriated them. A perfect stand-up comic, Susan had the ability to turn any story into a hilarious performance. The brunt of her tales included family members, friends, and especially people who were pretentious. She was never unkind, just factually correct and funny. A few topics come readily to mind and will doubtless bring smiles or even giggles to those who've heard them. Who can forget the story about Pop, Susan's dad, hanging all of his suits on the clothesline to ostensibly air them out, but really to let everyone in West End see how many suits he had? Or the one about her sister, who disliked being so thin that she ordered a product called Wait On and got even thinner as a result of drinking it. Or the long story on the allegation that Reggie and I held hands while riding on our bicycles. I'm very interested to read in her forthcoming autobiography her description of our earthquake experience on the Isle of Man We were sitting on our beds on a Sunday afternoon when the beds began a merry dance across the floor and the pictures began to shift and move on the walls. Describing our experience when we were safely back in the Bahamas was a highlight of our overseas travel. Our professional education and work experiences were similar. Our decisions to retire from the public service were forced by the same incident, the Mirage Report. Susan resigned her appointment as Assistant Director of Education with responsibility for tertiary education in the Bahamas and secured a position as Personnel Manager at the Roy West Trust Group of Companies, the oldest trust company in the Bahamas. Human resources management and the government's emphasis on Bahamianization were both in their infancy and led to the company's decision to recruit a group training officer. Susan had no difficulty locating a suitable person for the job, namely her friend, IVD. She became my supervisor, the International Human Resources Coordinator for the group, and eventually a member of the board of directors of the company. Susan was especially thoughtful and action-oriented. As newlyweds in 1951 and 52, Reggie and I lived in rental quarters on Meeting Street, and Susan and Sydney lived on Montrose Avenue in the Valley. They had secured one of two similar cottages and hoped we could live in the other, but it was already taken. A year later, on the day after her first child was born, Susan phoned me from her hospital bed to inform me that she had secured the soon-to-be vacated house next door to her home for us to move into. Later, when we moved to the then developing Oakesfield area, we lived about 3 city blocks apart. Clearly gifted in the arts, Susan was a good seamstress, an acceptable interior decorator, a promising artist, and a superior writer. She excelled at the written word. She wrote plays and acted in them. She wrote poems, and she wrote and published 12 books. Her autobiography, titled What Makes Me Tick, is to be edited and published posthumously. Once, when I asked her how soon she would finish the book, she said she wasn't sure how to end it. The one major difference between Susan and me related to our religious orientation. While I had been a quote-unquote holy roller member of the Brethren Assemblies for many years before meeting Susan, she was a devout Anglican. She and Sydney rode their bicycles from Montrose Avenue to St. Mary's Church off Nassau Street until they got their first car, although St. George's was almost directly opposite their house. After they moved to the Oakesfield area, in typical Susan fashion, they joined with others to create what became Holy Trinity Church, which began under a tent and now includes a church building, a manse, and a school. It was while entertaining visiting guests at their home on behalf of Holy Trinity that Susan and Sidney converted from being nominal Christians to being, in her words, sold out for Jesus. She started and conducted the church choir in the tent. She held prayer meetings at her home and was in the midst of anything and everything related to improving programs of the church and the spiritual growth of the members. Of course, I was included in many of Holy Trinity's activities to the extent that some thought I had become a full member there. When Susan was introduced to a Christian ladies group called Women's Aglow International, she became the first local president of Aglow in the Bahamas. She eventually served as a Aglow leader in the Caribbean, traveling and conducting meetings throughout the region. And then Grand Bahama began calling her back to her roots. Eventually, my friend fled the field she had so generously planted in New Providence for the fertile fields of Freeport. It was there that she settled into her most productive years of teaching, mentoring, and writing, with Sidney being her ever-present research assistant. Having earned a doctorate in biblical studies, Susan lived, taught, and wrote based almost entirely on the Word of God. As the years have flown and the distance has grown between our physical presence on earth, we envision a joyous reunion and sweet communion, more blessed than even our friendship was worth. We will share our joy in the presence of Him who gave His life for our own, and bow in praise as our voices will raise in celebration around God's throne. Meantime, I say so long, my friend, my faithful, funny, forever friend, Dr. Susan J. Bethel Wallace.